I normally talk about oral cancer, but today I met a woman who's got such an interesting disease. Would you call it a disease?
It is a disease, yes. Predominantly women only.
And it's called LAM, L-A-M.
LAM, Lymphangioleiomyomatosis. For short, we call it LAM for obvious reasons. So my name is Beth Daugherity. I am a twice rare patient. I also have Ehlers-Danlos, which has kind of gotten more popular, especially in the days of TikTok and other influencers. I think a lot of people have heard about Ehlers-Danlos, but LAM is still...
Okay, what is LAM? What is it? What were your symptoms?
I experienced cyclical, so menstrual-driven lung collapses. So at both ovulation or menses, depending, I would have shortness of breath, difficulty exercising, so I was exercise intolerant. I would also experience pressure or pain in my rib cage.
So this started when you started your period?
Yes, so it really, I started my period around 11, age of menses, but I started getting symptoms in college. So I can remember probably what I now know was a lung collapse when I was 20, and then had symptoms all throughout my 20s and 30s until I was finally diagnosed at 36.
So this is interesting. It took her a long time to finally get diagnosed.
Yeah, and it's hard because most women have OBGYNs, and a lot of them will have a primary care physician or a GP. Very few women have pulmonologists, and it's also a very male-dominated field. So at the time I was diagnosed, it was about 96% male pulmonology in the field.
So your lung would just collapse? What would it feel like?
So the first signs of a lung collapse are kind of a tickling. I refer to it as pop rocks. So if you've ever put pop rocks in your mouth, you would feel that sensation of the tickles as the air pops out. So if you think about having an old air mattress that you might be in a swimming pool or a lake, and you would, if it was leaking, you would submerge it to see where it was leaking and note the holes coming up. Well, that's the same sensation that you feel on the inside of your rib cage. When you have a lung collapse, that air is escaping the lung and building up outside the lung. And then as more and more air gets trapped outside the lung can't inflate like normal, and that's what we refer to as a collapse.
So after you'd have your period and you'd have a lung collapse or a feeling like that, then it repairs itself?
Yeah, you will absorb the rate of air that gets trapped outside. You will typically, if the lung stops leaking, so after ovulation or menses, the mechanisms that allow the air to escape, just like it allows the follicle to escape your ovary, or it allows your tissue to slough off from your uterus, after that stops allowing the air to escape the lung, you will reabsorb that air that's trapped on the outside of the lung at about 1% per day.
So you went to doctors and you're like, I noticed that every time I get my period, I'm having this issue. And what did they say to you?
Well, he said, no, these things don't, that's your reproductive system, this is your respiratory system, the two are not related. And it turns out in the realm, if you look at a Venn diagram of respiratory diseases and reproductive diseases, there's an overlap. It's about 4 things, and I just happen to have one of them. So
that is so interesting. So then you mentioned to me that you started taking, that things got really worse when you took the birth control pill.
Yeah, so when I was 20 and getting ready to get married, I went on oral birth control pills for 6 months before I got married and started really having symptoms, and also experienced symptoms after sex. So I would have post-orgasmic hemoptysis, because it's not just estrogen and progesterone that may be implicated in LAM symptomology, but also pitocin, oxytocin. So after, during the delivery of my daughter, actually, I'm now, hindsight is 20/20. I'm about 100% sure that I had a collapsed lung when I delivered her.
This is unbelievable. Okay, so then you finally decided to have your ovaries taken out?
Yes, against medical advice, I had my ovaries removed.
You go.
And I have been stable. I'm lucky enough that my symptoms were primarily hormonally driven. And I have been fairly stable since 2016. So
That's really something. And now she's doing something else that's against medical advice.
I'm
Taking
testosterone. So we're working slowly, and I'm working with an endocrinologist, and I'm being very responsible about taking testosterone on an experimental basis. And I'm getting regular PFTs, so that's pulmonary function tests, to make sure that the testosterone is not actually feeding LAM cells and causing more growth and proliferation of the LAM disease. And then I'm also getting my labs, regular blood work, to make sure that my estrogen is staying below a certain threshold.
And I learned an interesting word today, a new word called bleb.
Bleb.
Bleb. B-L-E-B.
It's like an air blister that's on the surface of the lung. Yeah.
Very interesting. So, when you think about oral cancer, I was a young woman, had no risk factors, and I had just had a miscarriage. And I believe that my cancer was related to the fact that I had a lot of stress. My hormones were in flux.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I've met so many women who this oral cancer has happened to have had they don't smoke, they don't drink.
Well, we know that the incidence, so I'm now also working on my PhD in cancer biology. So technically my degree will be in pharmaceutical science, but we look for, I do immunotherapies and look for targets for cancer treatments. So we know from cancer biology that things like estrogen is inflammatory, and a lot of the regulatory pathways in the body are actually under estrogen control, or estrogen is a factor in growth and proliferation pathways. And we see this all the time in postmenopausal women with estrogen withdrawal. You lose muscle, you lose bone, right? We see this constantly, but those pathways are the opposite when you have hyperactivation of these cancer cells from having too much estrogen or from having cyclical estrogen surges. We also see this with other inflammatory pathways, like you were talking about stress and cortisol, right? We all know how stress and cortisol affect us in a chronic way. It's really good for fight or flight, but it's really bad when it's activated all of the time.
Okay, if you want to learn more from Beth, you can find her information below and reach out. She will talk to you.
Yeah.
And and certainly if you think you have LAM or any symptoms of it, let her know.
Yeah, if you experience shortness of breath or pain around your menstrual cycle or ovulation that happens in your chest, especially it feels like pressure underneath your rib cage. You'll feel it when you're bent over or lying flat. Talk to your OBGYN, mention this to your GP, be persistent. We have to be our own advocates.
Yes, we do.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Awesome.
That was 8 minutes.